The interactions that we have in our game define how reactive the environment is, define how simulated that space feels, how real and immersive it reacts, and is a big part of driving emergent gameplay of, I see a thing, I understand it, I expect it to behave a certain way, and then it does. We make zoos primarily to demonstrate a playground of the functionality that we have. And also, here is an example setup of how those things are achieved. A designer is able to go in and see that if they've had any issue with their own implementation prior to bothering an engineer, they can take a look at the gold standard of here's a thing with nothing else working. See if that gives you some hints first before we start interrupting an engineer. If you go in and you find it broken, that's a good moment to call an engineer. All that in mind, we've been making an interaction zoo, a place to demonstrate all of the different nuanced and complicated interactions that we can get between a bunch of different entities that designers can go take a look at and draw inspiration from to pull into their levels, their ships, their whatever environments we're making. The reason I like zoos, philosophically, I believe as a game designer, the two core parts of gameplay are collision and doors. With our doors, we've got all these automatic doors, and those doors connect between rooms, and every time a door doesn't react the way you expect, it breaks your immersion and pulls you out of the game. Even with something simple like a control panel, we can explore things like enabling and disabling the proximity sensor so that you have control over whether or not it lets you through automatically or if you have to interact, and make sure it's all working properly. Beyond the control panels, there's the doors themselves, which give us many opportunities for complex and nuanced behaviors. So we've explored things where if you cut the power to a door, it'll stop its behavior. The lights will go out on the control panel and you won't be able to interact with it in that way anymore. But then maybe we make this wedge kit that you physically place on the door, which pries it open, and which allows you then to sneak through. And maybe even past that, there's the locks on the door could be physical and have their own state and have their own health, and if those things get changed, either by some lockpicking gameplay or some damage or some external thing that we could explore even beyond, that you might trigger an alarm. When alarm triggers, we want to have that event actually get passed through the environment. And so even just by having a single chain of communication, being able to interrupt it at any stage or alter it at any stage creates all this opportunity for subversion, reaction, for the doors to get locked down, and for the alarm lights to go off and start blaring, or for those things to fail to happen or get stuck in that state because something went wrong or some sabotage went right. As each thing feeds into the next behavior, it creates a world that feels real. It creates a world you can make a plan for and a world you can react to.
The way in which we interact with objects in the game world is essential to creating an immersive and enjoyable experience. And we hope that many of the interactions seen here, and quite a few that are maybe a little too early to share, will make their way into the persistent universe. But before that happens, it's time once again for a sprint report, so let's get to it. Now, there will be plenty of ship news coming out of IAE in the coming weeks, but let's go ahead and take a quick look at work from the graphics team on adding iridescence to the hard surface shader, seen here on the Talon Light Fighter from Asperia. Now, coming from the original concept, the iridescent paint allows us to showcase a variety of luminous colors that seemingly change when observed from different angles. This isn't necessarily the final look of the ship, but only a first implementation of this new aspect of the shader. You can bet that we'll be dialing it in further and that we'll see more of the Talon in later weeks ahead of its intended release in Alpha 3.12. As part of an overall effort to revamp and unify the way scanning and radar works for vehicles and FPS players alike, the vehicle tech team has progressed on what they're calling the Radar Object Collection Subsystem. Now, using a temporary back-end UI at the moment while it's still being developed, this will eventually form the underlying basis of finding and filtering almost anything with an ambient signature. You can see how enabling the resource filter shows mineable rocks ahead, while toggling the infrared adds the cutlass info that's a bit farther behind them. Now, since not all scanning options will be available in all situations, reducing our options down to a simple cross-section scan means that we can see the ship when unobstructed, but that scan data is now occluded as asteroids or other items come between you and your target. Now, as this develops, it will apply to both ships as well as players or NPCs hiding behind large objects, walls, or even doors. Meanwhile, work on refinery decks continues with this look at some of the exterior infrastructure and how that sits within the upcoming Lagrange point gas clouds. Now, this review specifically was to get an early look at what these stations might look like once they're embedded in the upcoming Alpha 3.12. After some consideration, one thought was that maybe a few more asteroids could be used to flesh out and more appropriately theme the exterior of these refinery stations. That was an easy call, but it will also have to be balanced with our desire to avoid turning our major trucking lanes into obstacle courses. Well, not all of them anyway. Now, while the look of these are coming along nicely, we'll talk more about how actual refining gameplay itself will work next week. Finally, let's check in once again with the ongoing work of our colonial-style homesteads. Last time, we saw the 2D concepts turned into 3D concepts, and that was a big step in helping us visualize and evaluate the direction we wanted to take them. What you're seeing here is the next step in that look dev process, where we've now taken the raw, very rough 3D concept meshes and brought them down to a planet in Engine, similar to the way the team reviewed 3D docking concepts by sticking them onto existing space stations. Now, it's important to note here that these are still concepts, and that the process of building them into viable in-game assets has not yet begun. So let's set our expectations accordingly. Tests like this are used to help us evaluate things like shape language, how the structures feel along or against certain landscapes, what kinds of visual stories can be told through placement, orientation, or combination, and even be used to help identify any sort of structure type that might still be missing from the proposed toy box. Beyond this test, it's also just a really cool look into Star Citizen's future, when one day frontier towns full of NPCs with jobs or missions can be found throughout the universe, and then one day later, players themselves creating outposts all their own. Rest assured that as work progresses, we'll keep following. So what did we learn about this week? Well, that there's a lot of potential in the way that we interact with doors, airlocks, and more in creating new gameplay opportunities. That when somebody asks what color your talent is, you can kind of say all of them. That changes are ahead for scanning and radar. And that someday I'm going to be the mayor of my own Discoburg, or Discoville, or Dystopia. For Inside Star Citizen, I'm Jared Huckabee. We'll see you next week.